Hold this image in your head. A small suitcase on an airport floor, and inside it, everything a family with generations of history in a country was allowed to take with them, including the money. 55 British pounds. Not per family, per person. That was the limit a dictator imposed in 1972 on tens of thousands of people. He gave 90 days to disappear from the only country many of them had ever known as home. These people weren't tourists or recent immigrants. Many had been born there, daughters and granddaughters of people who had arrived decades earlier, when India was still a British colony. Over 2 generations, they had built the commercial backbone of an entire country. And overnight, a man who had seized power in a military coup decided that these people's very existence there was, in his own words, a problem only a dream sent by God had revealed how to solve. The dictator's name was Idi Amin. The country was Uganda. And what happened after that decision is one of the most complete examples in modern history of how expelling a minority can, on its own, break an entire national economy's backbone almost overnight. Let's go back in time to the moment it all began. Uganda gained independence from the United Kingdom in 1962. Inside the country lived a community of Indian and Pakistani origin that already numbered in the tens of thousands, descendants in large part of workers brought in by the British decades earlier to build the railway linking the interior of East Africa to the coast, a colonial engineering project that cost thousands of the lives of the very Indian laborers contracted to build it. Many of these workers, once the work was done, decided to stay, open small businesses, and generation after generation rose from street vendor to shop owner, then factory owner, then owner of entire networks of businesses spread across the country. In 1971, an officer in Uganda's own army, Idi Amin, staged a military coup while the country's president, Milton Obote, was traveling abroad and declared himself head of state. Amin had joined the army back under British colonial rule decades earlier and had risen through the ranks through brute force and loyalty shown in violent military campaigns, not through any political or economic training. Hold on to that detail because it explains everything that follows. Amin had no economic training whatsoever, nor any plan of governance beyond consolidating power through violence and public scapegoating. On August 4th, 1972, Amin stood on a podium and declared what he himself called an economic war. He announced he would expel Asians from the country, initially the roughly 50,000 who held British passports, and just days later, he expanded the decree to include practically all non-citizens, around 60,000 people in total out of an Asian population of nearly 80,000. The deadline given was 90 days. The public justification was that this community was sabotaging the economy and encouraging corruption. But Amin himself, in interviews and speeches at the time, left the real motivation far less disguised. He went as far as referring to Asians as the country's brown Jews, a direct reference to their dominance over commerce, and months later, he sent a telegram to the UN Secretary General expressing what sounded, to practically everyone who read it, like sympathy for the way Hitler had treated Jews in Germany. This wasn't reform, it was expulsion based on ethnic identity, wrapped in the language of economic justice. And the numbers behind it show exactly the scale of the problem Amin was about to create for his own country. In 1972, this community made up about 1% of Uganda's total population, yet it controlled 90% of all businesses in the country and was responsible for 90% of all tax revenue. That's not an exaggeration for the sake of the script. It's the portrait of a community that, over 2 generations, had literally become the commercial and fiscal backbone of an entire nation. And it was exactly that backbone that Amin was about to rip out, with 90 days' notice. Families had to sell, abandon, or simply leave behind houses, cars, shops, entire farms, carrying at most the equivalent of 55 British pounds per person, an amount deliberately small enough to ensure no one left the country with enough capital to start over elsewhere without help. Around 27,000 people took refuge in the United Kingdom. Another 6,000 went to Canada, 4,500 to India, and thousands more scattered across Kenya, Pakistan, and other Commonwealth countries. Uganda's Asian population, which stood at 96,000 in 1968, plummeted to around 1,000 by the end of 1972. Think about the scale of that drop. An entire group practically wiped off the country's demographic map within months. And what happened to everything these families left behind? Around 5,655 businesses, farms, ranches, and properties were confiscated by the state and redistributed, but not to the general population, as Amin's rhetoric had promised. Most of it ended up in the hands of allies of the regime itself, mainly army officers who, in many cases, simply sold off whatever they could sell and shut down the rest. The common man Amin claimed to be benefiting almost never saw a single cent of that redistributed wealth. And here's the mechanism any economist would recognize from a mile away. You can confiscate a shop in a day. You can't, along with it, confiscate the knowledge of how to run a business, the supplier network built over decades, or the accumulated experience of 2 entire generations working in the same industry. That knowledge left the country inside that same 55-pound suitcase and never came back. The result was immediate and devastating. Without the former owners, and with no one prepared to take over managing these businesses, much of the economy simply stopped functioning. There was a shortage of spare parts, a shortage of maintenance, a shortage of basic operational know-how. Many cotton and tea processing plants, sectors that depended on imported machinery and constant technical upkeep, sat literally idle for lack of anyone who knew how to fix them. Tax revenue, which had depended on that same 1% of the population for 90% of the total, collapsed right along with it. Store shelves emptied out. Entire industries ground to a halt. The country that had once exported surplus manufactured goods to its East African neighbors began, at times, importing the very same basic goods it had manufactured itself just years before. The international community reacted almost immediately. India severed diplomatic relations with Uganda. The United Kingdom froze a £10.4 million loan it had granted the country the year before. Amin simply ignored the pressure and pressed on. In the years that followed, Amin's regime did not correct course. It doubled down. The country spiraled into further nationalizations, disorderly expansion of the public sector, systemic corruption, and widespread mismanagement, which together destroyed wages, industries, and entire national institutions. At the same time, the regime systematically persecuted political opponents, intellectuals, journalists, and entire ethnic groups suspected of supporting the deposed president. International human rights organizations estimate somewhere between 100,000 and 500,000 people were killed over Amin's 8 years in power. In 1978, in a strategic blunder that would mark the beginning of the end, Amin ordered an invasion of neighboring Tanzania. Tanzania's response, joined by forces of Ugandan exiles, was devastating. In April 1979, Tanzanian troops took the capital, Kampala, and Amin fled into exile, where he would live until his death in 2003. Never having faced trial for either chapter of destruction he set in motion, the economic one and the human one. The country he left behind would take decades to recover. His immediate successor tried to reverse part of the damage, offering restitution of confiscated properties in hopes of drawing the expelled Asians back. Few returned. The wound was still too raw, and the country's political instability in the years that followed, including a civil war that dragged on for nearly half a decade after Amin's fall, offered no real guarantee of safety for people who had been expelled under threat of violence. It was only starting in 1986 when Yoweri Museveni took power after years of guerrilla warfare against the governments that succeeded Amin that the Asian community actually began growing again in Uganda. Museveni publicly criticized the old dictator's policies and directly invited the expelled Indians to return, restoring part of the thousands of properties that could still be identified and handed back to their original owners or their descendants. Those who returned helped rebuild part of the economy their parents and grandparents had originally built, and today hold a relatively well-established financial position in the country, with a visible presence once again in commerce, industry, and Uganda's banking sector. Even so, the size of the community never returned to what it was before 1972. Most of the roughly 27,000 families who settled in the United Kingdom, for instance, built new lives there, and few descendants chose to move back to Uganda for good after rebuilding everything from scratch on another continent. Museveni remains in power to this day, nearly 4 decades later, in a government described by international observers as politically dominant and not very competitive, but one that at least brought enough stability for economic rebuilding to happen. What this episode leaves behind as a lesson is different from what usually shows up in stories of land reform or nationalization carried out under the banner of historical justice. Here, there was no genuine grievance behind the rhetoric. There was a dictator newly arrived in power, with no economic plan, using a visible and commercially dominant minority as an easy scapegoat to consolidate immediate popular support. Amin's economic war didn't correct any inequality. It simply transferred wealth from people who knew how to manage it to people who didn't. And the entire country paid the price for that for decades. Still, it's worth noting that, according to nearly every account from the time, the policy was immensely popular among part of the Ugandan population the moment it was announced. An uncomfortable reminder that economically disastrous measures can, in the short term, be politically popular, especially when wrapped in the language of historical correction or economic nationalism. What Uganda's 1972 story leaves us with is an even more extreme version of a lesson that repeats itself in other countries, in other decades. You can expel an entire community in 90 days. There's no decree capable of expelling, along with it, only the inconvenient part, while preserving the knowledge, the network, and the trust that same community took generations to build. Uganda lost both at once, and it took more than a decade under a completely different government just to start rebuilding a fraction of what it had destroyed in 3 months. Look closely at this timeline, because the contrast sums up the whole story. Amin seized power in 1971. 19 months later, in August 1972, came the expulsion decree, and the collapse started showing up almost immediately, still within that same year. Amin stayed in power for 7 more years after that, until falling in 1979. And the country went through 7 more years of civil war and instability after his fall, until in 1986, 14 years after the original expulsion, a government finally took over, willing to invite the families back and truly begin rebuilding. Destruction took 90 days. Beginning to rebuild took 14 years. What do you think? Is there any meaningful difference between expelling a minority under the language of economic justice and doing it purely out of ethnic prejudice dressed up as public policy? Or does the end result, economic collapse, decades of rebuilding, a wound that never truly closes, end up being the same either way, no matter which flag the government of the moment decides to fly? Let us know in the comments. And subscribe to Viridian, because this is exactly the kind of story we exist to tell.